This is Charlotte Katakuri, second son of obese matriarch Charlotte Linlin, brother of 84 siblings, eater of one too many donuts at one time, which is when he ripped his mouth open, and I'm just gonna say it right here, right off the bat, the best antagonist in the entire almost 30-year history of One Piece. And I'm going to take a painful amount of time to tell you exactly why, as we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the series in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring Mr. Perfection himself, Charlotte Katakuri. A man who had no right I say, to casually stroll into the series as late as he did, and to be anywhere near as compelling as he was. And as part of this video, I'm also currently wearing my Katakuri t-shirt, available in my store through a link in the description, many other shirts as well. But because Katakuri is a product of an era that I define as late stage pre-Wano One Piece, he actually has a different introduction in the manga than he does in the anime. And that's because in the anime, Toei were desperate for all of the filler that they could milk out of the story teat of Eiichiro Oda. And so they took Katakuri and they inserted him much earlier into the Whole Cake Island arc, as he does have an ominous cameo before we properly meet him. And it's such a simple thing, but it goes against one of the core ideas of Katakuri, which I will explain shortly. But you'd be hard pressed to find a better official introduction to a character than Katakuri in the manga, who we meet at the entrance of Big Mom's tea party, and his first act in the series is to kill a man with a jelly bean right between the eyes as well. And the juxtaposition of the devastation this man can inflict with the most mundane and harmless of candies instantly elevates Katakuri beyond any Charlotte family member that we'd experienced to that point, with the exception of maybe Big Mom, but it's a maybe. And so Katakuri accomplishes a lot in just 2 pages, and part of this is also to do with his unusually no-nonsense design. When I was reading this chapter weekly, I could not believe that this man was a One Piece character. He initially looks like he'd be a lot more at home in a seinen manga, although Eiichiro Oda's original Katakuri design definitely feels a lot more like classic One Piece, and also fits perfectly into the lineup of Charlotte's siblings, who are this group of very wackily proportioned individuals. However, my personal theory as to why this design changed is that during Whole Cake Island, Oda suddenly realized that he would need Luffy to actually overcome an antagonist, because the major antagonist of Whole Cake Island is Big Mom, but defeating her was out of the question. So I think that what he did right was visually elevate this original Pompadour Katakuri to be able to step into the role that a more traditional arc antagonist would occupy. Although very curiously, Katakuri is one of the rare One Piece antagonists who was introduced without Oda's classic ominous villainous shading. The dude just appears out of nowhere with a full design. And I think that's very purposeful, because thematically, as readers, we are not supposed to clock Katakuri. We're not meant to see some ominous being and be aware of it as a huge threat. No. A big aspect of Katakuri's character is to be able to see into the future, and the way he is written is to leave us as readers with what feels like a knowledge deficit, which is why I really like that he gets the jump on us. We're halfway through the Whole Cake Island arc, we think we know everything it is that we need to deal with, but then this guy, he comes out of nowhere to completely perfectly ruin our plans. And as a reader, it gives me a great degree of reverence for Katakuri, because even though I, man on the internet, am real and Katakuri is fictional, somehow he is the one in charge of this experience. And long story less long, that's why I'm not a big fan of the cameo introduction that the anime gave him, because that flags Katakuri to the audience as a threat to be aware of, and so he loses a lot of that surprise and narrative command that he had in the manga, because we as an audience are already keeping track of him. Those sorts of cameos are essentially giving the audience access to future sight, which we don't need yet, because you definitely know what to expect in the future when you see a lingering shot of an ominous figure. And again, with Katakuri, we don't want that. We need to feel that he has superior vision over us. And we really do need to linger on this, because Katakuri is the future sight antagonist. Others have had this ability since him, but Katakuri was our first and strongest showcase of this advancement of observation haki. And Oda was able to use this as a great source of dramatic moments that we've never really been able to replicate with any other characters, even Luffy. Katakuri constantly uses future sight to give us these little flash forwards, and one of my favorite examples of this is when all of the Luffys pop out of the wedding cake. But before we see that, we have Katakuri in a state of panic because he's seeing it before we do, and he can't do anything to stop the chaos and danger that comes with this act. And shortly after this, there is a moment when Capone Gang Beige uses Katakuri's facial expression to help dictate his next move. He says that Katakuri is looking pretty pale, meaning that their plan is going to work and they should continue. And Capone Gang Beige then unleashes this incredible line: "You can see a bit into the future, that's all. But that ain't some special privilege. Everyone has an equal right to change the future." And that is one of the big thematic struggles between Luffy and Katakuri. Luffy proving these words that he has that equal ability to change the future when he's up against a man who can literally see into the future. But Katakuri also has a decent sense for the future in general. Even though he's not at that level yet, he very quickly comes to the conclusion that Luffy will one day become a true threat to his mother and his family, and that's why Katakuri makes the decision to pursue Luffy personally, which is very similar to Smoker's thought process after Logtown. And this leads to quite a bit of inner conflict with Katakuri himself, because it's easy to think of him as the big bad villain man of Whole Cake Island, but in reality Katakuri also fits very cleanly into the classic princess role as well. He and his siblings are trapped under the tyranny of their rather large maternal figure, Charlotte Linlin, and deep down what Katakuri is searching for is a person who can change the future for him and his family and do the classic One Piece thing of liberating a kingdom, which leads us away from Katakuri's technical purpose in the story, which is to be used as a vehicle to teach Luffy and us, the readers, about future sight. But the real meat of Katakuri is in the concept of perfection. According to adorable sister Charlotte Brûlé, Brother Katakuri is not just undefeated. Not once in his life has his back ever touched the ground. Legend says he stood up on his own 2 feet the moment he was born. He's never laid down in his life. He's a man who even looks down on the earth. He is proud, cold, and powerful at all times, the perfect man. And he was then referred to as the, quote, greatest masterpiece of the Charlotte family, a title that Katakuri created for himself purely to be able to protect his siblings. As a child, Katakuri's sister Charlotte Brûlé was targeted by a gang of kids because Katakuri beat them up after they made fun of his mouth due to the donut incident where he ripped it open. But after all of that, Katakuri decided that for the sake of his family's safety, he was going to hide his mouth and never show any weakness or flaw in any fiber of his being. He took on the philosophy of perfection for the safety of others. And as a result, Katakuri will go to any extremes to defend this image. There's one point in his fight against Luffy where Katakuri gets flung back and he purposely slams his head into the ground just to avoid having his back hit the ground first. So the mindset here is that if Katakuri's perfection is broken, then that leaves his family vulnerable. So Luffy is initially fighting Katakuri so that his crew can escape, and Katakuri is initially fighting Luffy for the safety of his family. It's a really great take on the idea of perfection. And antagonists who believe themselves to be perfect are often quite impossible to empathize with because they actively separate themselves from humanity. A couple of One Piece based examples would be J. Garcia Saturn and God NL. Each of them believed that they were perfect beings, but Katakuri is a character that we can actually empathize with. He is a character who uses his perfection to become more human instead of less. And so as readers, or at least as me, man on the internet, I actively supported his quest for perfection because he wasn't doing it for himself. There is a greater purpose and meaning behind this image that no other antagonist in the series has backing them. And I honestly don't know if we will ever see another antagonist with this level of sheer willpower, which is equal to that of Luffy. Although this quest for perfection has turned Katakuri into something that Luffy would never become. After Pedro sacrifices himself, Katakuri says, "What's with all you people getting emotional, huh?" Indicating that in the quest for perfection, Katakuri has had to abandon such indulgences, and much of his character arc throughout his fight with Luffy is about learning to feel these emotions again. And in terms of perfection, this also connects quite strongly with the idea of future sight, because it means that Katakuri almost always has perfect information and can always make the correct move. One thing that really terrified me about Katakuri when I was reading weekly was that he positioned himself aboard the Thousand Sunny whilst Big Mom was chasing the Straw Hats. Traditional villain logic would dictate that, we're all good now. They've got no chance against Big Mom. She'll destroy them for sure. Let's all go and do something else and get surprised that they weren't destroyed later. But Katakuri wasn't taking any chances, and I really respect that level of caution in an antagonist. It happens so frustratingly rarely. And later on, Katakuri also refuses to do the standard annoying anime and manga thing of just sitting there letting a shonen protagonist power up. The very first time that Luffy tries to use Gear 4th, Katakuri easily stops him and says, "Why must I sit sit back and watch you as you prepare to exhibit power-ups that I already know are coming. Straw Hat Luffy, let me be clear, I refuse to underestimate you. Which is really kind of trippy to think about, because despite positioning himself as the perfect being, Katakuri is somehow completely free of arrogance, which makes him very likable, but it also sets him apart from most One Piece antagonists who are generally undone by arrogance. You got your crocodiles, you got Doflamingos, you got your Kaidos, your Saint Saturns, and the list keeps it goes on. They're all arrogant, except this man. So Katakuri isn't going to make stupid mistakes that lead to his downfall, meaning that defeating Katakuri can only be achieved if Luffy earns it, which is something that Luffy certainly understands when he says to Brule that he wants to surpass Katakuri at his best and defeat the Billion Berry Man. And starting from this point of perfection, Oda slowly breaks Katakuri down, endearing us to his imperfection. For example, early Katakuri often speaks in absolutes. Aboard the Thousand Sunny, he says to Luffy, "You will not leave while I am here," which isn't just stereotypical villain talk. It's a carefully considered statement of confidence generated from being able to literally look into the future. And throughout Katakuri's tenure as an antagonist, it is up to Luffy to change those absolute outcomes and to live up to the words spewed by Capone Gang Beige that everyone has an equal right to change the future. And constantly overcoming the future that Katakuri sees is what forms a series of very, very slow steps towards him respecting Luffy. After changing the future for the first time, when Luffy gets Katakuri off the Thousand Sunny by forcing him into the mirror world, Katakuri even says, "Well done." Not in a patronizing way either. Katakuri was offering genuine praise for the efforts of his opponent. And Luffy also confronts Katakuri's imperfections directly by catching him mid-merienda. And what's this? There's Katakuri doing all of the things it is that his legend states he didn't. Stuffing donuts blissfully into his gob while lying down comfortably on his back. He's even using one of the donuts as a pillow, which I love. And Katakuri himself refers to his behavior as sinful as he consumes his delicious forbidden donuts. And look, I guess he's quite right, because this is an indulgence in gluttony that clouds his vision and prevents Katakuri from killing Luffy on that one occasion. And even Katakuri's devil fruit abilities are used to present and then break the illusion of perfection. Katakuri masquerades as a Logia, using his future sight to make sure that no one can hit his mochi body, and making his opponents feel like trying to stand against him is completely useless because not even Haki seems to work on this supposedly Logia body. But once Luffy figures out that Katakuri is a special paramecia, this is a colossal mental win for him because it confirms that Katakuri is not in fact invincible or perfect, and with enough effort and willpower, even he can be brought down. Which is a huge break in perfection for Mr. Katakuri, who relies very strongly on his presentation breaking his opponents long before his fists do. And Katakuri also becomes a lot easier to hit the more emotional he becomes, whether it be anger and stress at the beginning of the fight or excitement and respect towards the end. The more emotions that Luffy is able to elicit from him, the more flawed Katakuri's fighting style becomes. But also, from their very first punch, it is clear that Katakuri uses his abilities in an extremely similar way to that of Luffy, and that Oda has deliberately set up Katakuri as a mirror match for Luffy, one that takes place in a literal mirror world, which I love because it's very rare that the location of a fight ends up being of much meaningful significance. But the mirror world, it is a very in-your-face, inescapable visual metaphor of the duel that is taking place within it. The main difference, as stated by Katakuri, is the way he uses his abilities is far more efficient than how Luffy uses his. And as a result, Katakuri is able to achieve a very tangible advantage over Luffy in every single area. Combat, speed, durability, strength, versatility, whatever it is, Katakuri wins. On top of that, he's also an awakened devil fruit user, and Luffy is not at this point. And so there is nothing that Luffy can do that Katakuri can't do better, which is also reflected in Katakuri's bounty, which is 1,057,000,000 berries. The 57 million was chosen because 57 is one number higher than Luffy's trademark number 56. And also, for me personally, Katakuri's powers are more visually compelling. Sometimes to a creepy extent, like when he divided his legs into these terrifying mochi tendrils, and sometimes to a hilarious extent, like when he turned his whole body into a donut to avoid Luffy's attacks. To me, this whole fight is a masterpiece, not just of One Piece or of manga, but it's a real treasure of media in general, as the choreography is on point in each and every single panel panel, and all of the hits feel viscerally brutal. Every hit landed on either Luffy or Katakuri feels painful, but at the same time, each of these panels are works of art of their own, and this fight, in my opinion, is Oda's combat renaissance, and one that I don't think we've reached the heights of either before or since in One Piece. But this puts us in a bit of a rough position, because if Katakuri is just flat out superior, then how could Luffy ever beat him without it feeling like, bullshit? Well, there is one and only one weapon that Luffy effectively wields against Katakuri in this fight, which is the battle of willpower and reasoning that is taking place in the mental realm. Katakuri has an extremely tough time understanding Luffy, and whilst most antagonists probably wouldn't care, and they generally don't care, that understanding is very important for Katakuri, and trying to understand Luffy changes him. After briefly escaping the mirror world and then returning, Katakuri can't even comprehend why Luffy came back to the fight. He can only think of three options. 1, Luffy preferred death to the shame of running away and being a coward. 2, Luffy was prepared to recognize Katakuri's superiority. Or 3, Luffy wanted to work for Katakuri. But when Luffy says that he came back to defeat Katakuri, Mr. Perfection coolly states that that wasn't an option, because Katakuri has this perfect balance as an antagonist. At this point, he 100% believes that Luffy winning isn't possible, and again, somehow he's not speaking from a place of arrogance. He's not underestimating Luffy as everyone else has done before and after him. Katakuri just knows what the future holds, and it is incumbent on Luffy to break that. Katakuri physically dominates a good 95% or even more of this fight, and while he's able to deal some pretty extreme damage to Luffy's body, Katakuri never once manages to damage Luffy's drive and willpower, which I think is most potently demonstrated during this series of panels of Luffy taking a beating, but making fierce, determined eye contact with Katakuri as if he is still well and truly in this fight, which is a seed that leads to the mental unraveling of Katakuri, who just can't figure out why that light won't disappear from Luffy's eyes. And furthermore, Katakuri does start to panic and invest more emotionally the closer and closer that Luffy gets to using Future Sight at will, as Luffy inches closer and closer to being able to use Katakuri's own abilities. So the longer this fight goes on, the more physically overwhelmed Luffy is being, and the more mentally overwhelmed Katakuri is being. And also, there's a very key point where Katakuri starts to see a lot of himself within Luffy, particularly when Luffy states that his crew thinks he's gonna win because they believe in him. This is a hugely underrated moment in this fight, and to be fair, it doesn't have a lot of meaning until you later fully understand Katakuri's motivations, but in this moment, it is clear that the Straw Hats have the same faith and belief in Luffy as Katakuri's family have in him. Luffy isn't perfect, and in fact, he's just the opposite of perfection in every way. Later on in the fight, Luffy even starts yelling out a bunch of stuff like how hungry he is and how much pain he's in, which he justifies by saying that yelling all of these things makes me feel better, as opposed to Katakuri, who still has all of these feelings but keeps them bottled up in the name of perfection. And yet, with all of these unsightly imperfections, Luffy is still able to manifest that same level of hope, inspiration, and respect that Katakuri has gone to some pretty tremendous extremes to achieve. And so Luffy didn't intend to do this, but he is showing Katakuri that there is another way to become the man he wants to be. And in Katakuri's own words, after this moment, he was starting to admit that Luffy was worthy. And that is when Flampe happens. Charlotte Flampe is Katakuri's younger sister and president of the Katakuri fan club, which is a thing that exists on Whole Cake Island, and Flampe, in her quest to maintain her idol's perfection, decides to interfere with the fight to remove the struggle from Katakuri, because perfect beings cannot be allowed to struggle. So she interferes with the fight battle, and Katakuri inflicts a winning, decisive blow on Luffy. And rather than being pleased, Katakuri is initially furious, absolutely livid that Luffy lost focus in battle. Katakuri actually gets so angry that the light he wanted to snuff out so badly is actually gone. But after realizing Flampe interfered, Katakuri inflicted the same wound on himself, and he does this for a couple of reasons. One, because Katakuri's definition of perfection would not allow him to attain victory via the help of others. If the fight had ended here, then it would be as good as conceding that Katakuri could not beat Luffy without help. And secondly, because Katakuri had started to identify with Luffy so strongly that Katakuri believed that Luffy had every right to continue this contest to fight on behalf of those who believe in him, the same way that Katakuri does for his family. That same family who just interfered with the fight, mind you. And as part of this, Katakuri also reveals his face and embraces his imperfections for the first time. When two men are fighting, the last thing I need is some half-assed assistance. If you're gonna laugh at that idiot, then laugh at me too. A very emotional outburst as Katakuri gets closer and closer to taking on Luffy's mental characteristics, whilst Luffy gets closer and closer to learning how to use Katakuri's abilities. And as time goes on, this becomes far less of a protagonist versus antagonist affair, but more of a protagonist versus protagonist fight, which is an extremely impressive accomplishment that I don't think anyone else in this video series can claim. The fact that Katakuri was a solid enough character to rival Luffy in his own story and make me root for him every bit as much as I did for Luffy. It really is a perfect example of how a good battle manga is written, which is to use fights to develop characters. And Katakuri is a character developed to perfection almost exclusively through this one fight battle. Plus, antagonists that bring out a new Luffy transformation always have a very special place in One Piece history, which is why against all odds people still have vivid memories of Bluno, because he was the first person who Luffy used Gear 2nd against, as well as Rob Lucci with Gear 3rd, Doflamingo with 4th, now Katakuri with Snake Man, and in the future Kaido with Gear 5th. But in this case we have Snake Man, a bespoke power-up designed for Luffy to specifically deal with Katakuri. It involves sacrificing most of the strength offered by Gear 4th and instead focusing on speed and reach. Luffy was purposely trying to combat Future Sight by designing an attack that would eventually hit, and so the pressure was put on Katakuri to continuously use Future Sight to dodge these impossibly fast homing fists coming at him from otherwise unpredictable directions. And even then, it was not enough to bring Katakuri down. All of Luffy's immense physical process is still overcome by this man. And so this fight reaches a conclusion that's still debated to this very day, as Luffy gets up one last time and Katakuri deliberately falls onto his back, conceding the fight, as well as conceding his own legend and accepting his imperfection. So there's an argument to say that Katakuri could have physically continued, and I do think that if he was driven enough, he could have beaten Luffy. But that's not the point of this ending. The point is that by this stage, Katakuri had undergone a full character arc from antagonist to protagonist, and rather than seeing Luffy as a threat to his family, Katakuri began to see Luffy as the hope for his family, as someone who could continue to evolve, defy the foreseeable future, and one day return to Whole Cake Island to liberate the Charlotte siblings from Big Mom. So Katakuri had no reason left to fight. In fact, he now had an active investment in Luffy's safety and subsequent escape from Whole Cake Island, which is such a wonderfully unique way for a One Piece fight to end. Almost every other antagonist is knocked unconscious by some big final attack, which is usually, but not always, fist-based. But this fight ended in mutual respect, as shown by Luffy covering Katakuri's face before leaving, as both of them achieved what they needed. And in retrospect, something else very notable about Katakuri is that this is the last great pre-Gear 5th fight, as Gear 5th has very much changed Luffy's dynamic with subsequent antagonists, which is a balance that I think Oda is still trying to find between that maximum freedom and actually being able to give Luffy a challenge. But I don't think we will ever see another fight like Luffy versus Katakuri in One Piece again. This was the peak of a very specific era that no longer exists. And furthermore, this fight was one of Luffy's longest, as it took 12 hours in world, meaning that it took Luffy infinitely longer to beat Katakuri than it did to beat Kaido, which we know because a lot of the Kaido fight is timed the moment he lifts up Onigashima, and there is a point where it gets contained to within a window of 5 minutes. So the entire raid on Onigashima, including Kaido's defeat, was only a couple of hours at most. And Katakuri's legacy continues well beyond his tenure, as every time Future Sight comes up, I am reminded of the groundwork laid by Katakuri and the rewards that Luffy fought his absolute hardest to obtain, such as during the Udon prison segment of Wano, where Luffy stopped Babanuki's Excite shot because he saw a quote, pretty bad future. Small moments like that have so much weight behind them, and that is all thanks to Katakuri. And this is also a legacy that has not gone unrewarded by fans. In the World Top 100 character poll, Katakuri was voted by One Piece fans all around the world as the 14th most popular character out of well over 1,000 choices, making him officially the most popular antagonist in all of One Piece. His nearest rivals were Crocodile in 17th place and Doflamingo in 20th. However, after that, you need to go all the way to 43rd and 46th place to even find another antagonist antagonists in the top 50, being Rob Lucci and Blackbeard respectively. Only five antagonists crack the top 50, and Katakuri was the only one to come within striking distance of the top 10. Katakuri is just a character on a different level, carrying out such a flawless antagonist arc that he set an impossibly high standard that I don't think any other had reached before or since. Mr. Imperfect turns out to be the perfect antagonist to me, and I don't think that S tier accurately defines just how well Katakuri did in this story, so what I need to do is open up a very special Doughnut tier category that sits above all, just for Katakuri, and you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Vander Decken, one of the more controversial One Piece antagonists who is almost universally despised to a point where many readers and watchers would prefer if he never existed at all. But are we being too harsh on old Mr. Vander Decken and not really appreciating what it is he brought to the table? I mean, maybe what he brought was a plate of feces, but perhaps it was a gourmet dish for a very acquired taste. Whatever it is, we're gonna figure it out, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the series in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the man who may or may not literally be a mushroom, Vander Decken. That's a genuine theory because Vander Decken is a fisherman whose family actually came from the surface, and he has the same amount of legs as a race known as the Kinokobito, mushroom people, one of which we saw trapped in Big Mom's library, and no other fisherman has this four-legged characteristic. So the idea here is that Vander Decken's ancestor was a mushroom man that dove deep into the sea and then did some things with some fish. And then 8 generations later, here we are with Vander Decken the Ninth. But Vander Decken's introduction is deliberately similar to Brook's during Thriller Bark. We see this terrifyingly cool ghost ship with an unknown figure singing, and my favorite part of this is that the most scared character is Brook, despite the fact that this is exactly what he used to do. But then Brook goes on to give us some valuable insight. That ship doesn't belong in this world. It's hundreds of years old. On a stormy night, a pirate captain suddenly went mad and threw his crew overboard. He drowned them all and cursed to the gods. His name was Captain Vander Decken, and his ship was the Flying Dutchman. To punish him, the gods decreed that he should roam the seas for all eternity. And in retrospect, this discussion about gods is fascinating. When Fishman Island was being published weekly, we didn't really take this talk about gods seriously. It was all just exaggerated or even completely made up legends to us. However, with the focus on gods that modern One Piece has, I'm actually very interested in Vander Decken's potential encounter with what appears to be some sort of sea god. However, in addition to the ship and the legend, we also see a glimpse of Vander Decken himself, a cloaked figure with a classic Oda silhouetted smile, and it's pretty unsettling but also a very effective setup. You've got this underwater ghost ship containing a figure who is said to be hundreds of years old. It holds a lot of promise about discovering something deep and dark about the One Piece world, something that existed in the days of Nolan's, the days of Oars, and perhaps even during the Void Century, and something that is threatening enough to have survived this long. And that is our first key issue with Vander Decken, which is that promise is immediately broken. To say that Vander Decken does not live up to the legend is putting it very nicely, as when we do see Vander Decken's full design, it's not even the man who we've been talking about. Our antagonist is in fact Vander Decken the Ninth, a descendant of the legendary original Vander Decken, which I remember being quite disappointed by even before we got to know him, because what we have here is a case of legend nepotism. Vander Decken has inherited his status from his ancestor, but as we'll see, he very much does not deserve it. And this isn't all that strange for One Piece. Oda does this sort of thing all the time. He portrays a fearsome idea and then reveals it to be a comical sham. And this format very much fits Vander Decken, and it does result in a lot of comedy, such as when he throws an axe claiming that he never misses his mark, but it comes back and chops off the mast of his own ship. That is very funny. I like it a lot. But I think the whole idea of Vander Decken is something that gets punished by a case of poor timing. As one of the first primary antagonists of the post-time skip era, Vander Decken doesn't meet the expectation of a villain who can command a compelling challenge for the newly reunited Straw Hats, because we trained for 2 whole years with the mission to become strong enough to enter the new world, and our first obstacle is a very pre-time skip level of antagonist. I could definitely see Vander Decken working very well in an earlier arc, a much earlier arc. Like maybe if Vander Decken was a member of Baroque Works, or if he was another weirdo working for Gecko Moria, or even part of the Arlong Pirates, which could have happened. Apparently Arlong wanted and courted Vander Decken to become part of his crew, so there is a crazy alternate reality out there where Vander Decken could have been forced fought during East Blue, but he very much has that vibe about him. Not a particularly strong villain with a crazy character quirk and a mildly troublesome but creative devil fruit. That is a lot of pre-time skip One Piece villains, which is unfortunate because at no point does Vander Decken feel like a problem that we need the post-time skip Straw Hats to solve. To give him some credit, Vander Decken does have a brutally villainous moment when he stabs Hart-chan, which is infuriating because we love Hart-chan at this stage. Luffy punched St. Charles at the human auction house just because Hart-chan got shot, and the way that Vander Decken stabbed him was so disrespectful, by using his devil fruits to stab Hart-chan in the back like a coward. But this does set him up as quite a smart villain. Definitely lacking in power, but strongly capable in the field of deception. This is what this scene sets Vander Decken up as. But Fisherman Island doesn't really ever make good on that. The Vander Decken we go on to see isn't particularly smart or effective. At no point beyond this is Vander Decken anything to be afraid of beyond needing to monitor the bushes outside of your windows. Although one thing I do love about him that doesn't get explored too much in One Piece is that Vander Decken is a Fishman devil fruit user. So there's a lot of really interesting logistical issues surrounding his existence living underwater, and eating devil fruits are often referred to as cursing the user by taking away their ability to swim, and in no character is that curse more present than Vander Decken. So he does carry on the legacy of his cursed ancestor in some way, and there are other fishermen with devil fruits like Jack and Sasaki, but neither of them get to explore this curse to the same degree that Vander Decken does. But with that, we should talk about what is, I think, 95% of Vander Decken's character, which would be his infatuation with Princess Shirahoshi. I want to start by saying that characters obsessed with love are insufferable at the best of times in shonen manga, and with One Piece, due to the nature of it being a battle manga, as well as Eiichiro Oda's personal writing rules, love isn't something that's ever going to be explored beyond a surface level gimmick. So that's not a good sign for Vander Decken, because if that's all there is to him, then we know that we're not going to really dive deeply into any of that. And so what you see in his first scene is exactly what you get in every scene. Vander Decken's always yelling a variant of, "Swear your love to me or die. Your life can only consist of marriage or death." He says that a lot, many iterations of, "If I can't have you, then I'll kill you." And he says it a lot because there's just not much else for him to say. Again, One Piece isn't the kind of manga that's designed to explore anything insightful with this kind of toxic obsession, which might be a shame because Vander Decken's fruit, the Mata-Mata no Mi, is very much the ultimate nightmare stalkerish fruit, always allowing him to find Shirahoshi no matter where on the planet she goes. It's quite terrifying. And the mechanics of his devil fruit do also result in some creepiness. Let me explain. Vander Decken records his targets by touching them with his palm, but if he was to then touch a different person with that same palm, then it overwrites and records a new target. Meaning that in pursuit of his obsession with Shirahoshi, Vander Decken hasn't washed his hand since he first touched her 10 years ago, which just adds to that uncomfortable creepiness because you just know that this hand is going to be the most putrid thing that you've ever had the misfortune of being around. I will give Vander Decken some credit though, because I do think that his true motivations with Shirahoshi are often forgotten beneath all of the obnoxious marriage proposals. But Vander Decken had no interest in Shirahoshi until she used the powers of Poseidon for the first time, which is very relevant as the original Vander Decken's life goal was to find Poseidon, and that's why this maybe Mushroom Man sailed all the way down to the sea floor. So the larger goal here is something actually vaguely understandable, which is Vander Decken the Ninth wanting to fulfill his ancestors' wishes and legacy, which is very One Piece and we have seen done before in more palatable cases, like Mont Blanc Cricket wanting to discover the truth of his ancestor Noland. It's just the way that Vander Decken goes about fulfilling this legacy that becomes highly creepy and questionable. But an argument can be made that he's in love with the idea of Poseidon much more so than Shirahoshi. I don't know if that argument holds up very well, we'll see. But that's why he wants to lock Poseidon down ASAP via marriage, and also why Vander Decken says stuff like, if he can't have Shirahoshi, then no one else can. Because he's not just talking about an obsession with a mermaid, he's talking about someone else potentially gaining the ability to use Poseidon. And I should say that the idea for the Shirahoshi infatuation potentially has its origins in Wagner's The Flying Dutchman opera, which features a sea captain cursed to roam the world forever until he can find a faithful wife to break that curse, which in a roundabout way is what's happening here. Vander Decken is trying to break the curse of his family line by obtaining and marrying Poseidon, thus I guess finding a faithful wife, but in his case the faithful wife part is irrelevant, it's just what he wants. And I also can't be too generous with him because he does very early on develop an actual obsession with Shirahoshi herself. And his plan is to get his hands on the Tamate box, which is said to have the power to make anyone age, which we know is true through the energy steroids, it's a side effect, but Vander Decken wanted to age Shirahoshi up to turn her into a quote, sexy young woman. So at the very least, he's not attracted to children. That's probably Vander Decken's biggest redeeming quality, which is more of a baseline expectation for everyone else. But it doesn't help that every time Vander Decken describes his infatuation, he needs to linger on a physical element of Shirahoshi. Like when he says, "That's my Shirahoshi," beautiful in both body and mind. He can never compliment her without saying something like, "Damn, you got some sweet mega mermaid milkers on ya." And even with the legacy of his ancestor in mind, Vander Decken doesn't have particularly well-constructed plans of what he'd do even if he did get access to Poseidon. As far as we know from his own mental image, he'd only use it to become extremely wealthy. All we get of his dreams of the future is this mental pile of treasure. So despite this potentially very interesting exploration of inherited will, it's all in the service of a whole lot of nothing. And look, there is some poetic wankery that you could assign to it. The fact that Vander Decken's ancestor dove so deep and it's all in service of something so shallow in the modern day. And there's also the idea of the original Vander Decken's dream being to seek the cold, dark depths of the sea, whilst the dream of the original mermaid princess was to rise up and live under the warm, bright sun of the surface. And then you've also got the dichotomy of Hody Jones fighting for his pursuit of twisted hate, joining forces with Vander Decken the Ninth pursuing his twisted love. A very nice little toxic yin-yang. So there are definite ideas happening here, and I think they're intentional. But Vander Decken just isn't a great vehicle to explore and expand them. Although one more positive thing I will say about this is that the whole Shirahoshi situation does lead to one pretty great moment of comedy, which is when Vander Decken asks Shirahoshi to marry him and she replies that Vander Decken just isn't her type, which I think is a hilariously mundane reply given the circumstances, and Vander Decken's face afterwards always cracks me up, as does the fact that he shaved his head out of grief afterwards in a very Britney Spears-esque meltdown. But what this comes down to is that Shirahoshi is Vander Decken's main emotional plot. However, despite the fact that Vander Decken is responsible for her current situation of being locked up and protected and everything, Shirahoshi's main emotional beats are all about Hody Jones, and the fact that she made a promise to not hate her mother's murderer, because Otohime wanted to stop the cycle of hatred and prevent her children from being consumed by it, lest they end up like Hody Jones themselves. That's where Shirahoshi's entire emotional weight is geared towards. It's all about Hody Jones, and Vander Decken is very much this awkward third wheel in this dynamic. Although another minor plus for Vander Decken is seeing a pirate alliance form between he and Hody Jones. That was very cool. As I've said about Vander Decken in this video, as well as Hody in his own examination, neither of these guys really carried the expectation of a post-time skip One Piece antagonist, so it was definitely a good idea to have them join forces, because that at least gives us something to work with. Individually, they're both kind of nothing. Together, maybe they're a thing. And it also gives us something to break down at the end of the arc, because this alliance does not end well. But to linger on Hody, he unfortunately makes Vander Decken look a lot less compelling by juxtaposition, as Hody's goal is quite esoteric, and it boils down to the concept of spreading and sustaining hatred for reasons that he himself doesn't quite understand. But enthralled by the feeling, he concocts a plan to overthrow the Ryugu monarchy for the purpose of eventually spreading hatred throughout the entire world. So you've got that as one villain's goal. Meanwhile, what Vander Decken wants to do is marry a child and age her up to a more effable state. So there's a pretty big disconnect of ambition here. And one antagonist is always more compelling than the other, and unfortunately that antagonist is not Vander Decken. Furthermore, I should say that Hody isn't traditionally remembered as one of the narratively stronger villains in the series either, so to be overshadowed by him is an incredibly bad sign. And Vander Decken's involvement in the rest of the arc can be summed up as follows. Shirahoshi politely rejects him, and he throws a tantrum and then throws an arc. Vander Decken is so full of hurt feelings from this rejection that he resolves to, quote, smash everything. And throwing the Noah at Shirahoshi is a very cool idea, and it almost makes the entire character worth it, almost. Because what I like about this is that it does give Shirahoshi the opportunity to be actively involved in the arc and make a huge decision to potentially sacrifice herself to save the people of Fishman Island. Great moment for Shirahoshi, Shirohoshi. Beautiful. I love it when she gets herself in front of the ship. But as for Vander Decken, he gets a bit of an unconventional arc climax, if you can call it that as a villain. It's more of an arc anti-climax. It's not good. Which is that he gets betrayed by the other arc antagonist, although to be fair, Vander Decken kind of screwed Hody over first. But the idea is that Hody wants to kill Vander Decken so that his devil fruit abilities wear off. Meaning that at this stage, the Noah, which is kind of up here, would just fall and destroy Fishman Island no matter what Shirohoshi did. And that is a very dramatically sound idea. However, the Vander Decken character is so incompetent at its core that he can't even die properly to service this idea. Because what happens is he survives Hody's attack, and then Vander Decken slips, falls over, hits his head, knocking himself unconscious, which releases his abilities and the Noah does start to fall. And look, if he had died right then and there when Hody attacked him, I think that would have gone a long way towards redeeming the character. Not in terms of making us like him or respect him or even appreciate him, but having a dramatic moment like that to at least build up to something that made it maybe worth our time to follow him. But Vander Decken doesn't get any kind of satisfying defeat. There's no punishment for his assorted crimes. There's no fight. There's no emotional conflict. He doesn't even get knocked out by Luffy and other Straw Hat, Shirohoshi, or even Hody. He's just a bit of a goof and slips over and removes himself from the climax of the arc that he is one of the dual main antagonists of, and isn't seen again until everything's all over as they tie Vander Decken and Hody Jones up Scooby-Doo style, and we're done here. Back to the mystery machine for another adventure. And that's the very last we see of Vander Decken in the manga, and almost the last we see of him in One Piece media in general. His only other appearance to date was a cameo in One Piece Stampede, where you briefly see him at the Pirates Festival hidden among a crowd. But when I was sitting down to write this video, I had a realization. And that realization was, I completely forgot what happened to Vander Decken at the end of Fishman Island. Which is slightly embarrassing because remembering what happened to fictional pirates is like my only job. But I hadn't forgotten what happened to him. It's just that what happened to Vander Decken was nothing, which is why I couldn't remember anything. And it's unfortunate because usually even the most hated One Piece villains get some kind of story beyond their arcs, something that adds an extra layer to them and makes them feel a bit more like living, breathing beings. But Vander Decken is very two-dimensional from start to finish, which is a shame because there are a lot of good ideas there that Vander Decken doesn't live up to. The character has a very solid foundation in the One Piece world, as well as through inspiration from real-world myths, so there's a lot that could have potentially been done with his ancestors' connection to Poseidon and inheriting that will, but all of these ideas just sort of get jizzed into a tissue in the shape of the Vander Decken that we do get. And I think he's a character who may slightly appreciate in the future, simply due to his lineage and connection with Poseidon. There's probably a very interesting story to tell about his ancestor who likely lived during the Void Century, but we're getting a bit desperate here because that is talking about a completely different character. As for Vander Decken the Ninth, I honestly think he's an E-tier villain. I can see the seeds of potential, and there are some cool and funny things that were done, but he did not rise to the occasion. He didn't have a satisfying conclusion. He's done nothing ever since, and arguably didn't do much of anything along the way, and that's kind of that. So you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Captain Morgan, and this is Captain Morgan right now. You may notice that he is no longer on screen because this is one of the incredibly rare One Piece characters that just up and vanished one day. Why was this and where are you now, Mr. Captain Morgan? Well, we're gonna find out. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video. This time featuring the man whose motto is probably, only two things in life are certain, death and axes. The former usually follows the latter. The deluded enigma that is Captain Axe Hand Morgan. Right, let's get straight into the axes. Morgan has a pretty incredible design for One Piece straight out of the gate, being introduced in chapter 4 with this amazing axe and a handle, elbow, and the metal jaw plate. Oda did so well with him aesthetically. He looks so cool. But it should be said that it is a complete miracle that we ended up with this, considering that this was Oda's original design for Captain Morgan, which makes a lot of sense, because here Oda was reportedly very much leaning into the idea of creating an older and crazier Helmeppo. And this is the Captain Morgan that we would have received if not for Oda's very first One Piece editor, Takanori Asada, one of the most important people in all of the One Piece's history, who was one of the very few voices at Shueisha pushing for One Piece to actually get published, and a man who Eiichiro Oda once described as, the more he drinks, the more he strips. This stripping editor is the guy responsible for Captain Morgan's design change because he called Oda's original original design a bit lame. And good on him, because he allowed Morgan to really carve out his own space during Romance Dawn, and the influence that Morgan has had on the series going forward, despite being absent, is incredibly profound. One of the things that's become more and more and more, and you know what, I'm going to say it a fourth time, more evident as One Piece has continued, is that Captain Morgan was the archetype for most major villains. He is a very distilled, and I don't want to say simplistic, but more streamlined version of Antagonist that Eiichiro Oda still creates to this very day, almost 3 decades later. And in particular, Morgan was almost like a beta test of the world nobles. Even all the way back in chapter 4, in the weakest of the weakest seas, we had a delusional leader who believed himself to possess a divine right. In fact, the very first thing we see of Captain Morgan is him saying, "I'm so great," to which his marine lackey replies, "Yes, sir, you certainly are, sir. You are the great Captain Morgan, sir." All it takes is those 2 lines of dialogue to establish that Morgan has made great efforts to separate himself, maybe not all the way from humanity like the world nobles do, but Morgan, he's well on his way. Furthermore, Morgan frequently refers to the citizens of Shellstown that he's theoretically meant to serve as peasants, in the same way that the world nobles look down upon those who dwell on the surface. And most fascinatingly, Morgan even implemented a taxation system on Shellstown that he refers to as tributes, which is a very small-scale copy of the heavenly tributes that the world nobles demand. And that's how Morgan affords to do things that he likes, like have a giant statue built in his honor, which, speaking of, Morgan said this of the statue: "The statue is like my person. Scratching it is the same as attacking me," which definitely shows that he is a step closer to that godlike delusion. And so when Luffy destroys the statue, it is arguable that this is the very first instance we see of the will of D being the enemies of the gods. As if someone positions themselves in a god or god-adjacent role, then Luffy is practically fated to collide with them and crush that belief. But it really is quite a shocking display of corruption, and something that a Marine could only get away with in the East Blue because no one is paying attention to it. But Morgan doesn't believe that his role as a Marine is to serve the people. God, disgusting. He believes that the people are designed to serve him. And according to Morgan himself, this is a matter of respect. It's not a question of how much they can pay, it's a question of their respect for me. And that is also a very world noble-like mindset. The ability to put a dollar amount on the concept of respect. And if you can't pay the tribute, then it implies that you don't respect him. And it doesn't take many guesses from there to figure out what Morgan's gonna do to you if you don't show respect. It's bad things. Rank means everything in this world. Remember that. My rank is the highest on this base, which makes me superior to everyone else here. This particular ranking belief is fun because the thing that absolutely pisses off Morgan the most about that monkey D. Luffy is that he has neither rank nor status. Of course, rank isn't something that Luffy can achieve because he's not a Marine, but status he certainly could. And as Luffy has gone on to do, achieving the status of Emperor of the Sea. But all the way back in chapter 4, Luffy doesn't even have a bounty. And so Morgan struggles to even acknowledge Luffy's existence as a person. These same core ideas have persisted in One Piece since the very beginning. Oda just finds new ways to explore them and, quite frankly, make them feel infinitely worse. And the greatest piece of evidence for Morgan being a beta test world noble is actually his son Helmeppo, who is essentially a Shellstown discounter world noble, because to Morgan's credit, he actually achieved status for himself. He wasn't born into it, although we'll talk more about that in a bit. For now, let's say that Morgan believes he's achieved that status for himself, and that no one around him is in any position to question that. Whereas Helmeppo should in fact be named Helnepo, because he is a pure product of nepotism. He just so happened to be fortunate enough to be the slime ejected by this man one day, and at the beginning of One Piece, his personality was informed entirely by who his father is, without ever earning a shred of substance for himself. And that is the world noble mindset, pure entitlement. And that's why it is beyond satisfying when Luffy punches Helmeppo, which again is like a prototype for Luffy eventually punching St. Charlos, because it's the exact same situation. A friend of Luffy's was being threatened, and so Luffy punched the person doing the threatening, a man of divine lineage. And after said punch, a high-ranking Marine was summoned to deal with him. Thankfully, during Shellstown, that was Captain Morgan instead of Kizaru, but all the same beats are there. Everyone in Shellstown is terrified of touching Helmeppo, with Luffy being the one exception, the enemy of the gods, whereas Helmeppo could more accurately be described as the enema of the gods. With that said, there's a couple of very important distinctions to make. The first is that despite acting more like a traditional world noble, Helmeppo does possess infinitely more humanity than his father does, as when Morgan discovers that Helmeppo didn't kill Rika, he orders one of his men to find and murder her, a child, and Morgan then kills that same Marine for refusing his order. That's a pretty big moment. Captain Morgan actually ends up humanizing Helmeppo a bit, because even a man of Helmeppo's sheer cocosity could never have imagined murdering a child. Morgan is a particular brand of vicious that Oda doesn't implement a lot in One Piece, with another example being when he orders his men to end their own lives after they question whether or not they can actually beat Luffy. Morgan says that's because he won't tolerate defeatists, but I would argue that all of these Marines are already defeatists for accepting Morgan's authority and blatant abuse of power. But even some of the very worst villains in One Piece, like Doflamingo, are still able to have, dare I say, human connections with members of his crew. There are people that Doflamingo values, and we see the same thing with Big Mom and even Kaido. But Captain Morgan doesn't value anyone, not even his own son, and in fact, especially not his own son. When Helmeppo yells, "Father, why aren't you hunting the brigand who hit me? Even you never laid a hand on my lovely yet masculine face before." After Helmeppo says that, Morgan replies, "Do you know why I've never hit you? It's because you're an idiot son who's not even worth hitting." In terms of attitude, Morgan is potentially an even more putrid existence than Arlong, because at least Arlong valued his crew members. Not just his close officers either, but each and every one of them. And some of this might come as news to you if you're an anime-only watcher, because a lot of the really horrible things that Captain Morgan did in the manga were censored in the anime. For example, he does not kill his own soldier for refusing to murder a child. What Morgan does instead is hit the soldier, but they frame it like he was hit with the blunt side of the axe, because even the One Piece anime couldn't handle what a bad dude this guy was. And as for another anime difference that really informs how we see Morgan, Shell's Town is where we see Zoro's flashback in the manga. However, in the anime, they do that during episode 19, which is in between Syrup Village and Baratier. And if I had to guess why, it would be to place the flashback closer to the Mihawk fight and have Zoro's legacy more fresh in the mind of the viewers, remembering that this was airing in the year 2000. So there was no on-demand viewing of One Piece. You got your one episode every week. And should Zoro's flashback have been put in Shell's Town, then it would have added up to about half a year before reaching the Mihawk fight, by which point Zoro's dream and quest may have been eroded by time and lost a lot of its punch. But look, the reason why any of this is important is the context that Captain Morgan in the manga was created to be a Zoro-based villain. Straw Hat recruitment arcs are always given an antagonist with quite a strong contrast to the Straw Hat in question being recruited, like Kuro for Usopp, Wapol for Chopper, the others for all the others. Captain Morgan was built around contrasting Zoro, and that's why Zoro, incredibly uncharacteristically for One Piece, gets the finishing blow on the main antagonist instead of Luffy, with one of the core contrasts being that both Morgan and Zoro believe in putting in the hard work. However, Morgan just believes that he's already reached his own personal pinnacle, whereas Zoro's eyes are set much higher to the world's greatest. However, Morgan's mind brain is happy with being Shell's Town's greatest, which I should say he probably does genuinely believe to be the world's greatest. And there is a very, very good reason for that, which is not at all Morgan's fault. Morgan's fault. Because Captain Morgan plays a pretty core role in one of the most satisfying and intriguing East Blue plot twists. As it turns out, Morgan was defeated by Kuro, but hypnotized into thinking that he beat Kuro in order for Kuro to put his vanishing plan into action. Kuro is also the one who broke Morgan's jaw, which is a nice piece of design flavor. However, there's also something much more sinister at play here, which is that you could make the argument that Captain Kuro is responsible for Morgan even being a villain to begin with, because prior to this encounter, there was no evidence to suggest that Morgan was a bad guy. His younger self was drawn as part of the film's Ed color spread, and we see nothing but a determined young Marine, and he actually demonstrates quite a bit of bravery when he thought that Kuro was going to kill him. So my personal headcanon is that Morgan was an average, decent Marine, but he was then hypnotized to believe that he, Captain Morgan, was the one who caught the Kuro, and that hypnosis affected him like a full-on inception. The thought of being that guy rapidly grew and festered into Morgan believing Kuro's lie. Morgan was tricked into believing that he had actually put in the work to deserve his position and his superiority, but all of that was programmed by Kuro, which also adds to the Zoro contrast. Morgan believes in Zoro's philosophy of putting in the hard work to attain the status, but regardless of what he believes, Morgan has never actually put that work in. He is a cardboard cutout, a hastily put together set piece to slap on a stage that still has wet paint on it on opening night, whereas Zoro is the lead actor who has trained his whole life for this role. But Captain Kuro really messed Morgan Doughnut. And knowing what he did makes dialogue like the following much more understandable and even quite tragic in retrospect. I don't mind if you use my status, but I only lay hands on people who defy me. Don't fool yourself. You are not the great one. I am great. I am the great one. Because of the hypnosis, that's all Morgan can think about. I am the great one who captured Captain Kuro. I am great. No one else is the great one. They didn't catch him. It was all me. I'm pretty great. And that's why Morgan believes that he is already at the pinnacle, already at the point of being statue-worthy, because in his poor and thoroughly violated mind, there is no room for any other achievements. He's already done the one and only thing that he's allowed to think about, which is why his eventual ending and disappearance is almost a relief. We'll get to that in a second. Because having brought up the Zoro contrast, I would also be remiss not to mention that Morgan is also meant to be a contrast to Kobe. Kobe's dream is to become a big, strong marineman, but Morgan ends up being even worse than Alvida. So Kobe's got to cope with this idea of somehow the first marine he's ever met being even worse than a filthy pirate. It's a big mental hurdle that Kobe needs Luffy's help to overcome. You and your navy are ruining Kobe's dream, said the monkey man, and after purging Captain Morgan, Kobe is allowed to pursue his dream and he enlists in the navy. But that was not the end for our axe-handed chap, as he's also the major antagonist in the Diary of Kobe Meppo cover story, and in fact he spends more time being the antagonist of this cover story than he does being the antagonist of Shellstown. But this cover story ends very, very well for Morgan, as he does end up escaping from Vice Admiral Garp thanks to Kobe's desire to save Helmeppo, which is lovely, very nice. Morgan, who saw no value in Helmeppo, discarded him, and Kobe, who saw some value in Helmeppo, risked his life to save him. And Morgan is also seen once more during the Django's Dance Paradise cover story, where Morgan and Django pass one another like ships in the daytime, as both former antagonists are having a lovely peaceful nap. And to this very day, that is the last that we have seen of former Captain Morgan in One Piece. For all intents and purposes, it's a pretty happily ever after kind of scenario. Not only did Morgan escape prison, but this incident also freed him of his position within the Marines, where he was trapped by the fabricated delusion of being the guy who caught Captain Kuro. In a way, our god of liberation also ended up freeing Morgan from his own personal prison, because this is a non-consensual fresh start for him now. It forced his mind beyond the hypnosis and to not fall back onto the thought that was implanted into him. And he's even given a very Luffy-like fresh start, as he sails through the East Blue just a man, a boat, and a barrel, which is actually the sort of ending that I've really come to appreciate for him. Although what I appreciated a lot less was Captain Morgan in the One Piece live action series. In the Netflix live action, Morgan is, yes, a bit of a narcissistic cock, but they made the very curious move not to include any of the tyrannical behavior that he displayed in the manga or even the anime. In the live action, he's actually a pretty chill dude, and the worst thing that he does is hit Helmeppo, which isn't even all that bad, because the audience at that point just kind of want him to get hit, so he's almost our hero. And it's really jarring when in episode 2, Garp strings him up and makes an example of him for essentially nothing. I mean, badness is kind of implied. I don't even know if it's implied. Maybe it's just implied because I know he's meant to be bad, but I don't ever see him doing anything bad. Live action Morgan was not the nicest of guy men, but that really is the crime that he was most guilty of, and that feels like a big misstep to me. He doesn't kill anyone, order anyone to kill anyone, order anyone to kill themselves, or even refer to people as being inferior to him. He doesn't demand tributes from the townsfolk, and the reason why he fights against Luffy, Zoro, and Nami is because they broke into his office to steal his map. It's just such a weird way to do Captain Morgan. Although there is one thing that I will say adds a nice little layer of sinisterness back in, which is that when Luffy and Nami break into his safe, there is a copy of Captain Kuro's bounty. And because Django doesn't exist in the One Piece live action, that may then imply that Morgan made a deal with Kuro without needing to be hypnotized, which would be a whole new level of corruption, and one that I wish they'd expanded on, instead of popping that in as an Easter egg and relying on audience theories to fill the pretty glaring gap they left open with Morgan. But live action Morgan is not the man we're dealing with today. Morgan is a solid frame for an antagonist. Introduced in chapter 4 and then defeated in chapter 6, there's not a whole lot you can do in that time, but Morgan was handled pretty damn efficiently. And thinking back on it, it's pretty amazing what you can actually get out of a 3-chapter villain arc. And while Morgan had such a short run, his story did end up spanning across 2 arcs, Shellstown and Syrup Village, as well as 2 cover stories, taking us on quite a journey, ending with him being a changed man. He might not necessarily be a good man, in fact, he probably isn't, but he is now a new type of bad at the very least. The fact is that there has been progression, and short as it may be, Captain Morgan has had an arc. Captain Morgan did everything he was given to do perfectly. It's just that Oda didn't give him a lot to do, which unfortunately limits how far up he can land on this tier list, and I do think that a C is as far as he can go. However, I do want it known that Morgan is the mold that every villain who stands above him was built from. And I'd also like you to let me know in the comments who you'd like to see ranked next. This is Kurozumi Orochi, one of the most universally despised creatures in all of fictional and non-fictional media, but for all of the right reasons, as he is one of the greatest and most underrated antagonists in One Piece. But man, on the internet, how underrated is he, you ask? Well, we're going to find out, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the obese from the east, Kurozumi Orochi. And the first thing to note about Orochi is his absence in Act 1 of Wano. We don't actually meet Orochi until Act 2. However, we are introduced to him through the landscape of Wano as we explore during Act 1. The pollution, the starvation, and the complete erosion of life shows the threat and impact of Orochi far more effectively than the actual character is capable of doing himself. Let's drop this right now. The idea of Orochi is that he is a toxin, he is a poison, a parasite, a drain, a disease, and so many other nefarious symptoms. Orochi is all of them. Because Wano is another example of an arc with dual main antagonists, Kaido and Orochi. It's a revamp of the Water 7 duo of Rob Lucci and Spandam. Kaido is the big physical punch threat of the arc. He's the one who kept the island physically trapped and under control, but Orochi is the spiritual threat. He is the one rotting and eroding the spirit of Wano. And I do think that we really needed a character like this. Kaido himself never could have been an adequate assault on the spirit of Wano. We really did need someone who was native to the island to rot Wano from the inside whilst Kaido attacked it from the outside. And on the left side of Orochi's full introduction panel, when we do finally meet him in Act 2, is a short montage of Wano. We pan out from Orochi in the flower capital to the wastelands outside, filled with only dry bones and starving creatures, and then we go even further to the pollution-producing factories that are killing the land. Oda very consistently portrays Orochi as and juxtaposes him directly against a force of pollution. He is a toxin that has infected the very heart of Wano and is slowly strangling it. Orochi's size is also a very important factor in this. People of Wano are just naturally much bigger than regular humans in One Piece. However, Orochi is a step even above that. He dwarfs many of the already massive Wano citizens, and in wondrous Oda style, Orochi has grown outwards as much as he has upwards, making him look like a giant ball of greed. And he's usually accompanied by all sorts of lavish items. Orochi is surrounded by limitless food of all different types, as well as a legion of women to entertain him, including, if you look very closely on the left, Nico Robin in the guise of Orochi. But Orochi is almost like this black hole of resources. Everything on Wano is slowly getting sucked into him until there is nothing left. And we are very, very close to that point by the time this arc begins. But another very important factor is that Orochi's full introduction very much centers around Komurasaki, who is Kozuki Hiyori in disguise. And while Orochi's people are starving, he is obsessed with simping. And one beautiful thing about the Wano arc is that this is initially portrayed to us as pretty disgusting. Like, oh my god, poor woman being subjected to this man ball. Especially after we learn that Komurasaki is Hiyori, because how much worse can it get? You killed your father and now he's trying to do things. That's my YouTube friendly way of putting it. But there is a brilliant twist to this. At one point, Momonosuke states, if Hiyori's identity is known, Orochi will set his sights on her. And Hiyori's identity wasn't known, but Orochi still set his sights on her, because Orochi's obsession with Hiyori is part of a curse of fate. Orochi lives in a state of perpetual fear of the return of the Kozuki clan prophesied by Toki. Orochi is trying to run from it. He is trying to kill it. He is trying to erase the Kozuki name from everywhere he can, but he cannot do it. Orochi cannot escape the Kozuki curse. From the day that Oden died 20 years ago, Orochi's fate was sealed. And his obsession with Komurasaki is what eventually kills Orochi for good, but we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Something that I really like about characters like Orochi is that they serve as artistic challenges for Oda, kind of like the opposite of the Boa Hancock problem. Oda has stated that Boa Hancock is by far the hardest character to draw in the series because he always needs to make sure that she looks like the most beautiful woman in the world. And on the other side of that scale is the Orochi class of characters who Oda always has to make look like the most putrid existences imaginable and continuously finding new ways to use them to disgust us. And one brilliant new way to do that would be child abuse. During Act 2, Orochi attempts to kill Toko after she laughs uncontrollably due to the smile fruit that he is responsible for infecting her with, which is a great little summary of Orochi. He's a compound poison that creates new problems out of his existing ones, and his execution of Yasu is a great example of the rot that Orochi was trying to inflict. Yasu was described as a saint of Wano, a man who, in a prelude to learning about the sun god Nika, inhabited Nika's qualities of always laughing, dancing, and keeping people's spirits high. And what makes Yasu particularly heartbreaking is that in the manga, it's assumed that he also ate a smile fruit and is laughing involuntarily, but his Vivia card reveals that Yasu did not eat a smile fruit. And so he's just playing along to show solidarity with Toko, and he is Abisu Town's only genuine source of joy. But either way, Yasu became the smiling, dancing spirit of Wano, the last thread of hope holding the soul of this island together, and Orochi killed him. And not only that, but he supplanted Yasu's genuine smile with his own smile. That's the spirit of my subjects. Laugh him into the afterlife. This is Wano. Bright, cheerful Wano. You might mistake it for paradise. And something that I've spoken about every now and then in this video series is the enduring battle of smiles that persists all across One Piece. It didn't just happen on Wano, it is a core motif. And the most dangerous of villains tend to be the ones who present themselves as corrupted joy boys, spreading suffering under the guise of joy, like Doflamingo building his own personal paradise of toy slaves on Dressrosa. And even though Orochi isn't a Luffy villain, he still falls into this category. He is morally one of the worst characters we've ever met, but I personally believe that Orochi is a far more interesting antagonist than Kaido, because Orochi is the one who gets the meat of the storytelling on Wano. And part of this is a surprisingly sympathetic flashback. This isn't Senor Pink levels of sympathy, nor would it excuse his actions if it was, but Orochi is a genuine victim. A long time ago, Orochi's grandfather, Kurozumi Granddaddy, attempted to poison his fellow daimyo in a bid to become shogun of Wano, but he was caught and forced to commit seppuku as punishment. Punishment, crime, and punishment. Quite simple, but that is not where it ended. As after the death of Kurozumi Grandpappy, the Kurozumi clan were hunted down and murdered by the citizens of Wano, even though they had nothing to do with the crime. And little child Orochi was one of those targets. And in this flashback panel, we see a woman running behind him that may well be his mother about to be captured and killed. Orochi spent his earliest years in the constant fear of being drowned in a river for something that he had nothing to do with. And this might be a stylistic choice for how Orochi perceived these people, but the Wano citizens are depicted as bloodthirsty monsters set on wiping out an entire group of people because they believe the entire Kurozumi clan to be a poison on Wano itself. And that did become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Orochi was treated like a monstrous poison that needed to be eradicated, and so Orochi became a monstrous poison to take vengeance on the island. In the interest of some fairness, I should say that Kurozumi Higurashi and Semimaru were almost certainly all on board with the original poisoning plan, and were also more objectively evil characters, which Orochi turned into, but he started out as a completely innocent child. What happened to him wasn't done by Kaido, it wasn't done by the force of any outsider, it was done by Wano itself. The manifestation of Orochi is this island reaping what it sowed. And by the time the Straw Hats get to Wano, there's only 2 living Kurozumi clan members left, Orochi and Tama, whose full name is Kurozumi Tama. So this entire clan was pretty successfully hunted, beaten, and then drowned in a river. And you know, look, if that had happened to my family, I'm honestly not sure if I would have the mental fortitude to not devolve into an Orochi-style quest for revenge. And to his credit, this was something that Kozuki Oden rather sympathized with, as part of his naked dancing was intended to be an apology to the Kurozumi clan, because Oden did feel sympathy for what happened to Orochi, as well as the responsibility to rectify it as heir to the Kozuki clan that allowed it to happen to begin with. Although no apology ideology was ever going to be enough for Orochi. And to him, the purpose of having Oden dance in the street for 5 years was to slowly but permanently erode the spirit of Wano. It wouldn't do a whole lot of good to kill Oden right then and there, it would just make him a martyr, and if anything, enhance the spirit of Wano. So Orochi needed to have people lose their faith in Oden and to turn him into the same fool that he was labeled as. In fact, when Oden returns to Wano and discovers what Orochi did, he writes in his journal, "I just know this, a fool has taken control of Wano, a weak, cowardly fool using the strength of a fearsome pirate." And so Orochi flips that by turning Oden into the fool, and he even becomes known as the Fool of a Lord by all of Wano, very successfully weakening and almost completely breaking the spirit of the country. The return of Kozuki Oden, rightful heir of Wano, had been the country's final hope, but the people's hopes were betrayed and their great disappointment eventually turned to anger. But I want to emphasize that it weakened the spirit, it did not destroy it, because the disease of Orochi was never going to be enough to fully break Wano, with Oden's presence and ultimate execution being like a vaccine designed to protect the spirit for the next 20 years. Those who watched Oden boiling and holding up his vassals for 1 whole hour, and those who heard about it afterwards, ensured that the spirit of Wano would be permanently inoculated against Orochi. He could torture them, he could destroy their land, he could kill them, but for 2 whole decades, the only thing that Orochi could not do was extinguish the spirit of Wano. Kaido even said that people would speak of Oden's spectacular death for years to come, and Oden's reply was, "They can forget me for all I care, my soul will live on." And in the same way that Oden persevered in boiling oil for an hour, Wano would persevere for the next 20 years. A very serious solution required to combat a very serious threat, because Orochi was such an incredibly dangerous man to Oden. Physically, yeah, he's no threat, even with a mythical Zoan fruit, but Shinobu described Orochi as a, quote, agent of vengeance with no interest in the good of the country, which meant that far more would be lost by confronting Orochi in physical combat because of how happy he was to blow everything up. And he even had, at all times, a horde of hostages ready to kill in case Oden acted up. And so Oden saw it as in the best interest of the country to bide his time and acquiesce to Orochi's demands, and every day of naked dancing ended up saving 100 lives. Oden danced once a week, so all in all, over 5 years, Kozuki Oden saved 26,000 lives. But I do have to give Orochi that credit as a villain. He was able to force Oden to fight on a very different battlefield, and the threat he posed to Wano was arguably greater than the threat the crocodile posed to Alabasta or Doflamingo to Dressrosa. It really was quite an antagonistic achievement. However, I will say that Orochi may have lived 20 years longer, but he was defeated on the same day that Oden died, as Oden actually ended up poisoning Orochi as well. Orochi may have boiled Oden, but Oden chilled Orochi's soul. No matter how hot the water was, Orochi wasn't able to warm himself in a bath because of the thought of the Kozuki clan. A thought that again, he tried and failed to eradicate and escape from for the next 20 years. And maybe, just maybe, Orochi should have saved us a lot of effort and tried to warm himself in the pot of oil. He may as well have, because after this point, there was nothing that Orochi was capable of doing to complete his vengeance. Again, Wano was already inoculated. And that's why Orochi becomes something of a non-entity during the raid of Onigashima, which is a massive chunk of the Wano arc, almost half of it, and Orochi's fade from relevance commences the moment that he is decapitated by Kaido and loses one of his many heads. The reasoning for this is that Orochi's purpose no longer matters to Kaido, but it also no longer matters to us as readers, because as soon as the raid actually begins and all of the vassals appear to attack, it becomes clear that Orochi had already been beaten 20 years ago. He was supposed to break the spirit of Wano, but it endured, and here we are 20 years later with all of the vassals reassembled and over 5,000 samurai leading the largest scale rebellion in the island's history, all to restore the Kozuki clan helmed by Momonosuke. The spirit of Wano endured and Orochi was completely beaten, which is why the vassals are so dismissive of him when they find Orochi and cut off another 6 of his heads. "We have no time to waste on the likes of you, Orochi. Your judgment will be served to you in hell." And it's not that Orochi is completely irrelevant going forward, especially because he does have that one last gasp with Kanjuro, but his endemic has been dealt with, and all that's really left is to clean up and eradicate, which is a task handled by Hiyori and Denjiro after Orochi is lured in by the Kozuki curse. He gets enchanted by the visage of Komurasaki, the obsession that would end up up killing him with his final head being sliced off and becoming one of the very rare antagonists, or indeed characters in general, to be straight up killed off in One Piece. And despite being so rare, this wasn't a grand moment at all, which you can very much feel because it plays out side by side with Luffy defeating Kaido. Orochi's defeat and his death is very simple, even casual, and that is exactly what he deserved, as all throughout Wano his threat continues to diminish and fizzle out, having been poisoned by Oden 20 years ago, and it ended up being that enduring spirit of Oden that vanquished Orochi once and for all through Hiyori and Denjiro to save the spirit of the island, whilst elsewhere Oden's legacy was also defeating Wano's physical threat with Momonosuke assisting Luffy. However, the true end to Orochi happens right at the conclusion of Wano. One of our final shots of this arc is Hiyori performing a show and stating that Orochi was born to burn. More accurately, Kurozumi was born to burn, which is quite clever on many levels. One, because it's a pun on the famous Oden line of being born to boil, and two, because Kurozumi means black charcoal. So charcoal was born to burn. However, this line received quite a bit of controversy when the chapter first came out, because the unofficial English translation translated this line as the Kurozumi were born to burn, implying Kurozumi plural. And part of this happened because it's often difficult to tell singular and plural apart in Japanese without strong context, and the English scans chose plural, which was a disaster because it implied that Hiyori was advocating for the burning of all of the Kurozumi, which is the exact mindset that inspired Orochi to begin with, and also the only surviving Kurozumi we have is Tama. However, this was cleared up by the official translation, which had Hiyori say, Kurozumi was born to burn, confirming that she was talking about Orochi singular. Now, certain fan translations have tried to quote fix this line because they still don't see it as good enough, such as the following: Kurozumi Orochi, charcoal like you is only worthy when it burns, which is just stupid and clunky and takes away from the reference to Oden. But English troubles aside, I really like this full stop on Orochi, because it was never enough to just physically beat him. We had to eradicate his toxin from the soul of Wano. And so Hiyori creating a show that will no doubt be performed for hundreds, maybe thousands of years down the line, solidifies a complete purging of Orochi's influence from the culture of Wano. It lands very well for me, but I can see how it might not necessarily be shonen friendly. As comes up a lot in this video series, One Piece is categorized as a battle manga, and so audience satisfaction with a character can often be directly tied to their action on page, and Orochi doesn't really have any action. He doesn't do any fights. He's not a villain that would traditionally land in a shonen series, at least not on his own, and Eiichiro Oda took a colossal risk by making Orochi the dual focus of Wano, an arc that lasted just over 4 years. And also, Orochi undergoes a reverse path as an antagonist. Generally, an arc builds towards a conflict with a final antagonist, and it ends rather explosively and climactically. But Orochi was a case where we work backwards. We start out strong, and over the course of Wano, Orochi disintegrates. Each passing chapter breaks him down further until he ends up as a literal pile of ash on the floor. And that was his whole purpose, to show the strength and will of Wano to resist Orochi's attack on the spirit of the island. And what Orochi does lack in traditional shonen qualities is made up for by Kaido. Because they're partners in this arc, you cannot talk about either one of them separately, even though that's exactly what we're doing right now and exactly what we will be doing with Kaido. But really, I don't have many bad things to say about Orochi as an antagonist. He does his job nigh on flawlessly. I think it would be very difficult to justify sticking him into the A tier or above, because that would be breaking into a legion of full package villains, but Orochi definitely deserves a B. He might not be to everyone's taste, but without him, the Wano arc would feel like a completely hollow and stale punch fest. Orochi is exactly what was needed to create and sustain the drama of the longest arc in One Piece, and you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Alvida. This is a slippery fruit, and now this is Alvida. Whoever this is, she has the distinction of being the first pirate punched in the face by a rubber boy in the series, and has gone on a splendid journey to now end up as the commander of an Emperor of the Sea. But was this position deserved? The short answer is no, but the long answer is the rest of this video. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video. show. This time featuring the woman who loves to go clubbing in all of the worst ways possible, Iron Mace Alvida. We're going to start with the introduction because that seems reasonable to me. And I don't think I've done a single video in this now like almost 30 video series that doesn't mention the word silhouette, and this video is no exception. However, it is slightly different in that Alvida is an antagonist who appears so early on in the series that she actually predates the trademark Oda villain silhouette and first appears in this rather flat and kind of underwhelming, it's a half darkness, whatever it is. In the beginning of One Piece, I do think that Oda was a bit afraid of using too much darkness in his art. Just as we talked about with the Captain Morgan video, Oda originally had a much brighter, goofy, and almost straight comedy intent with his art, but Takanori Asada, the first official editor of One Piece, really pushed Oda into more typically cool elements in order to balance the series out, which is a style that Oda did eventually master, but it took time. And I think that his reluctance to use too much darkness in his art in the very early chapters was part of that process. That aside, Alvida is a simple gal, and she was created to do a handful of very simple things, one of which does not get the appreciation it deserves. As in the anime, Alvida is very much our introduction to Yara pirates, but in the manga, Alvida is actually the second pirate captain that we meet. The first being Shanks in chapter 1. And I guess you could argue that we also met Roger on the very first page, if you want to go all semantic, and I'm actually on me, but we didn't get to know him or his philosophy on being a pirate, so I'm not counting it. But Oda, after introducing Shanks and his philosophy in chapter 1, made sure that Alvida was the exact opposite of Shanks in chapter 2. Alvida was worth 5 million berries, and she thought herself to be the very center of the pirating universe. There's even a part where she concocts a completely unique to her own mind-brain story where she's being hunted down by Zoro for her minuscule bounty, which comes after Shanks, who we now know was worth over 1 billion berries in chapter 1 and was the most humble man in East Blue. Shanks didn't and still doesn't hold himself above anyone or anything, which is most clearly seen when Shanks cleans Makino's bar after Higama makes a bit of a mess. And just look at this, mate, the captain himself on the floor wiping up, doing what is considered to be the lowest of work. We have crew people to do this, and the very first thing that we see of Alvida is her ordering her crew people to clean her ship because she sees herself as above the lowly act that is upkeep. Little things like that aren't coincidences. Oda took the model of Shanks and he did the exact opposite in every way with Alvida. Another one being that Shanks is very good with kids and Alvida is very good at beating kids. But most importantly, Shanks's iconic line of "good reason or not, nobody hurts a friend of mine" is flipped by Alvida, who, good reason or not, does nothing but hurt and threaten her own crew. So we saw what Luffy looks up to in the pirating world with Shanks, and then the more traditional what a pirate actually is with Alvida. So she's very important to establish that full spectrum of piracy. And speaking of opposites, Alvida is also the first One Piece character to be blessed and or cursed with a classic Oda quirk. In Alvida's case, she believes herself to be the most beautiful woman in the world, despite her aesthetics being more akin to a dugong cosplaying a cowboy. But I do always love this stark juxtaposition that Oda likes to create. And to this day, my favorite application of it is with Raizo, who is the greatest ninja that Wano has ever known, and yet he has absolutely no traditional qualities of a ninja. He's not stealthy, he's so big that he can't blend in, he's also just kind of a fool, and yet somehow he is the perfect ninja. But with Alvida, Oda has gone on to use her specific quirk a number of other times as the series has gone on. He tends to like this idea of women with non-traditionally attractive designs, believing themselves to be rather bewitching, such as Dr. Kureha, or speaking of ninjas earlier, Shinobu also had this quirk, but it all started with Alvida, and it was all inspired by her real-life namesake. Oda stated in the SBS of Volume 6 that Alvida was based on Alvide, a Viking princess who was relentlessly pursued by suitors, including a Danish prince, to the point where she decided to dress as a man and became the captain of her own ship, and even formed a crew comprised entirely of women. And what Oda did was subvert that inspiration, turning Alvida into a character who believes that she's being relentlessly pursued by either suitors or bounty hunters who also want to, her, but in reality, she isn't, at least not at this stage. We'll get to the transformation and what inspired that in a bit, but for now, this quirk was a very important factor, because it established to the readers and watchers of One Piece that villains don't have to be completely one note. Whereas in Chapter 1, Higuma was a pretty standard shonen bad guy. He was a prick, and there wasn't much more to him than that. However, with Alvida, Oda gave permission for the rest of the antagonists in One Piece to have these comedic traits, and even with the worst of the worst, we are always able to find something to laugh at, essentially turning all of the readers into joy people able to see life from the perspective of Luffy. But because Alvida is the very first villain that the Toei anime tackles, she's subject to a bunch of very weird anime changes that makes Alvida in general quite difficult to talk about. Episode 1 of the anime is actually based on Chapter 2 of the manga, but it adds this whole original plot of Alvida attacking a cruise ship with Nami on board, assumedly to introduce Nami as quickly as possible to help hook in some viewers. And so episode 1 takes place entirely at sea between the two ships. Whereas in the manga, this conflict actually takes place on Alvida's island base. There is no cruise ship, there is no Nami, just a boy in a barrel on a base, seen here looking incredibly underwhelming, not much better than when Luffy and Ace built their own countries on Dawn Island, really. And I can see why they changed it, because it just wasn't that exciting of an opening. But this change in location had some very unexpected consequences. Something very, very big for Kobe is that because Alvida's base was on an island, he had actually spent the past 2 years slowly building a boat with the intent to escape. And instead of using it for himself, Kobe actually offered the boat to Luffy. Part of this is because Kobe himself didn't have the courage yet to try and mount an escape, but I also think it says so much about the inner good of Kobe that he gave his only ticket out of slavery to Luffy, a guy he just met without a second thought. Good guy. And that's something that the One Piece anime doesn't give us, because it chooses to stage this entire story on the ships, where Kobe obviously can't have been building a secret boat and has no mechanism of escape. And so it becomes less about whether or not Kobe's going to summon the courage to liberate himself, because in the manga he does have the means to do so, and more of a flat story about a trapped boy who couldn't do anything even if he wanted to. Ironically, it kind of robs Kobe of his agency, and I like the idea that Kobe believes that this situation is all but helpless, and yet he has still spent the last 2 years clinging on to what little hope he can find. But more importantly, for the sake of this video, the manga gives Alvida a very symbolic moment, because she discovers Luffy and Kobe scheming together and immediately smashes Kobe's boat. And in less than a second, Alvida has taken away the hope that Kobe has been clinging on to for 2 years, making Alvida a much more compellingly despicable villain than she appears in the anime. And it's at this point that Luffy steps in, only after knowing that Kobe does actually have a will of his own, because you see, Luffy is no hero. He will not help people who refuse to help themselves. They need to have the will to fight on their own, and that boat was proof that Kobe did. And so I do think that the anime lessens Kobe's will to fight, but more importantly, it robs Alvida of that wonderfully villainous moment of crushing Kobe's hope. And this is a shame, because Alvida is an antagonist whose arc lasts 1 chapter. So little changes are actually big changes, because she has so little to work with. Alvida needs everything she can get to make a decent impression with this video. And one thing that definitely doesn't make a great impression is that Alvida gets Bellamy'd and beaten by Luffy in a single punch. And look, let's be fair, she's the first Luffy antagonist, and her being One Punch Man was a fantastic way to set Luffy up. And the Lord of the Coast got one punch in chapter 1, so Alvida's in pretty good company there. And what I will say for the anime is that this was a much more satisfying defeat there. The manga is quite underwhelming. But of course, this is far, far from the end of Iron Mace Alvida, although it is the end of Alvida as we know her. As from here, her body undergoes quite the transformation thanks to the Sube no Mi, or the slip fruit, and so all of the excess weight just slipped right off her. And it's often been theorized but never quite confirmed that this is a play on the Ugly Duckling, which is a Nordic fairy tale, so it's in keeping with Alvida's inspiration. But the tale ends with this ugly duckling realizing that it was no duck but a beautiful swan this entire time. And the theory here is that Oda turned Alvida into a beautiful swan because Alvida's flagship was called the Miss Love Duck. So you've got the duck connection there, and maybe that was the inspiration. But the cynical part of me says that Oda just needed an excuse to change Alvida's design into something, more appealing if he planned on using her again. And this is is 100% pure speculation, but it may even have been suggested by his editor, who again pushed Oda into a less wacky and more conventionally cool and attractive direction whenever he could. And it's difficult to say whether or not this change worked, because from this point on, Alvida, she does linger in the series. She began in East Blue and exists to this very day. We're currently on Elbaf as I'm recording this, and Alvida is present, not on the island, but in the overall story. But despite that presence, she is very much a non-entity. I would say that the most exciting piece of Alvida action by far was her follow-up appearance in the Buggy's Crew Adventure Chronicles, and Alvida certainly does deserve a mention in One Piece A series history for being one of the first characters recycled and rehabilitated by a cover story, and really showing us the potential that these cover stories had going forward. It was actually really fun to see Alvida and of course Mr. Buggy again, which is something that first time around I never thought that I would say about Alvida in particular. And one underrated aspect about using her is that it also gave us one of the very first tastes of One Piece mystery to mull over, because it was obvious that this woman was Alvida, but what was mind-boggling was how Alvida transformed, which there was no explanation for in the cover story. We were only told during Logtown. And if something like this happened today, there would be multiple theory videos on every One Piece channel discussing it endlessly. Now that probably wasn't quite the response to this at the time in the late 90s, but it does a very good job of piquing curiosity about what would otherwise be a completely throwaway character. With that said, unlike a lot of returning antagonists, Alvida doesn't really develop as a character at all, and in fact, I think she very much regresses, because I honestly struggle to find a way to describe thin Alvida's personality as anything other than empty. After the transformation, Alvida lost a lot of character with those kilos. She doesn't get angry anymore, she isn't overly ambitious, she's almost entirely lost a sense of narcissism. It's calmed down significantly at the very least. And I don't know what she is. She's very much just a rather pretty shell who Oda almost goes out of his way to never show expressing any kind of emotion anymore. And I actually feel like the ideal Buggy-Alvida dynamic was later nailed much better with Buggy and Mr. 3, where their increasingly weird, selfish, and comically nefarious ambitions enhance one another. Alvida is much more of a brick wall. She doesn't give Buggy or anyone a lot to work with. And I can't help but feel that Oda didn't really have a plan when reintroducing Alvida beyond the Logtown incident, and now what's happened is that he's ended up a bit stuck with her, as Buggy has risen all the way to the status of Emperor. Although one thing I do very, very much love is that Alvida is now technically considered to be the commander of an Emperor of the Sea. So on the Punk Records wiki page of historical Emperor commanders, one day you'll see King, Marco, Katakuri, and Alvida all talked about in equivalence to one another, as if they were all equally as influential figures on this world. And you just know that in Alvida's section, they are going to mention how she evilly managed to enslave hero of the Marines Kobe for 2 years. In retrospect, that's gonna look like quite the feat. So she's definitely benefited from being an earlier villain, I guess the earlier villain. And I will admit that even though there's nothing to work with, it is always nice to see Alvida, because Alvida reminds me of exactly how far Luffy has come since his very first pirate battle. Something that we're reminded of in almost every One Piece game as well, as Alvida is a heavily overrepresented character in game media. Alvida happens to be a playable character in 14 One Piece games, an enemy to defeat in a further 11 games, has a support appearance in another 5 games, and rocks up in a completely non-playable function in another 4 games, for a total of 34 One Piece games featuring Alvida. More than any other villain with the exception of Buggy. And it's also worth mentioning that Alvida is early enough that she was subject to the 4Kids English dub of One Piece, where she sounded a little something like this.
Oh, now, Luffy, don't you dare tell me that you don't recognize this face of mine.
And I believe that she was given a southern accent because of that there cowboy hat, because the exact same thing happened to Nico Robin with her cowboy hat.
I'm gonna take the little princess back to the castle and give her sugar and spice and everything nice.
So 4Kids really inundated Luffy with southern bales, and you can tell that Nico Robin in particular was heavily American localized, because she says both sue me and arm yourself, thus giving us the full pantheon of what it is to be an American. done. And I'd also like it noted that in the 4 kids Alvida seen in Logtown, we see the Logtown police threatening Alvida and Luffy with water pistols. And look, in their defense, to a Devil Fruit user, water pistols might actually be effective. I don't know. It's honestly not the dumbest thing that 4 kids did. Meanwhile, Alvida's live-action English portrayal would be seen as far more successful. I myself actually really like Alvida in the live action, and I think she's a lot more memorable in that series than either the anime or the manga, with a very good balance of narcissism and brutality. And there's also a really fun Alvida Easter egg in the live action. With the introduction of the Love Duck, Alvida's crew members are holding a mirror, and this is because of an SBS question that Oda was asked all the way back in Volume 6, which was, is there a mirror on Alvida's ship? Which I suppose had to be asked because people were questioning Alvida's eyes. Whoa, hey, she's gonna throw a club at me. Don't ask me. Man, what a dangerous question. Something tells me that there is no mirror. Donk. Whoa, she threw something. And you also have to give Alvida's actress nothing but credit for the dedication of replicating Alvida's transformation, as she has now transformed her own body but without the gift of fictional fruit to assist the process. But back to Alvida as we know her, in many ways it's not fair to rank an antagonist who only served for a single chapter, but Alvida has such a large and lengthy legacy that it makes her impossible to ignore. I will say that she did her 1 chapter job perfectly, it's just that there wasn't much to be done. And if it was just that, then fine, decent ranking, but the real letdown is with her lack of evolution ever since, because she has been part of One Piece since the very beginning, 28 years, and it's just incredibly underwhelming compared to every other antagonist, and especially compared to Buggy, who was introduced in the same era, and as mentioned before, he is now an Emperor of the Sea. It really highlights just how much Alvida hasn't done or hasn't been given to do, because ever since Logtown, she's just kind of been a frozen statue that gets carted around wherever Buggy's crew goes. So I think this might sound harsh, but the only fair place I see for Alvida is E tier, which I think is a fantastic sign for One Piece as a whole. We really want it to be nothing but up from our first villain, and for the most part, that is exactly what we get. But you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Kaido, the man who dominates the One Piece world on land, sea, and air, which I do believe are all of the things, and he is said to be the strongest creature in the world with a very Kai-do attitude, but Kai does, or Kai doesn't, he challenged the very top tier of well-rounded antagonists in One Piece. Well, we're going to find out because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring an intro that I haven't even finished writing, so insert something clever, it's Kaido. So usually I don't like to leave scripts incomplete, but I've made an exception for this man, because Kaido himself believes that he is incomplete. And I'm not entirely sure that fictional pirate creator man Eiichiro Oda was able to complete him either. But this is a long story, and the first thing to note about the Kaido is that he is the world's slowest burn character. Kaido was originally mentioned in chapter 432 by Monkey D. Garp, which is also where we see Kaido's infamous and hilarious original silhouette, and this was way back in 2006. Oda took a name we'd never heard and he immediately equated it to the likes of Shanks and Whitebeard, which is very important because 2 chapters later Shanks and Whitebeard would clash, splitting the sky open, and what that act meant for Kaido is that for a man who wouldn't appear for another 350 chapters, Kaido stocks opened at an extreme high. He instantly became one of the most highly anticipated characters in the entire series, because he was one of the 4 emperors of the Yonko, and we just seen what they could do. It was lots, so people could not wait to meet him. However, wait they would. Oh, would they wait? In fact, if you started school in 2006, then you would not only have graduated high school, but also likely have graduated university by the time that Luffy was actually fighting Kaido during the raid on Onigashima. But we later learn on Thriller Bark that Gecko Moria was defeated by this man, granting us another vaguely Kaido-shaped hype nugget. And just before the Paramount War, we learned that Shanks had confronted Kaido in the New World. Then on Punk Hazard, we saw Luffy and Trafalgar Law form an alliance to take down Kaido, which is what officially put this boy on the menu. But even then, after this moment on Punk Hazard, it would be another 2.5 years before we actually met Kaido, which finally occurred in August 2015. 8 years and 10 months after his name was first said by Garp, Kaido would be officially introduced in chapter 795. And Kaido had has easily the best introduction of any One Piece character in my opinion, hero or villain or whatever's in between. Nothing tops this, and it took four whole pages of narrator dialogue dedicated to introducing Kaido. This is a man who challenged the Marines and the 4 emperors and was caught 18 times and endured 1,000 tortures. He was sentenced to death 40 times. When he was hanged, the rope snapped. When he was put under the guillotine, the blade cracked. When skewered, the spear broke. Ultimately, he sank 9 different prison vessels, meaning none of these people were able to kill him. And that included he himself. His hobby is word I can't say on YouTube, and his name is Kaido, King of the Beasts. People say in a one-on-one fight, always bet on Kaido. Land, sea, and air. Out of every living thing in the world, this pirate is said to be the strongest creature alive. And again, there is no better introduction in the series, and I don't think there ever will be. Although those last words were some that Oda would come to regret writing. But even after this introduction, it would be a further 2 years before Luffy made contact with Kaido, which finally occurred in chapter 922, which was published a full 12 years after we first heard Kaido's name. And from here, it became Eiichiro Oda's job to now pay off the 12 years of setup and expectations that he conjured. I think the only other antagonist with a slower burn in this series is Blackbeard. He was introduced well before Kaido and still has yet to be dealt with. And Blackbeard is also going to be extremely difficult to handle in a satisfying way when we do fully dive into him. But for now, it should be noted that Kaido was a ladder antagonist. He was set up as the peak, and we had to climb Caesar Clown, Don Quixote Doflamingo, and Charlotte Katakuri slowly and arc by arc just to get to the opportunity that is Kaido. So Oda charged himself with writing and implementing a worthy saga climax antagonist that should theoretically top all 3 of the characters it is that I just said. Did Oda achieve that? Look, probably not. I mean, yeah, in the case of Caesar, that's kind of a freebie, but I personally think that Kaido has a really rough time stacking up against the other 2. And one of Kaido's most commonly cited problems by the fan base is his motivation. However, I think that Kaido has a much stronger motivation than he tends to get credit for. And it is something that only gets stronger the longer One Piece goes on. Kaido had an assortment of goals, but he was mainly working towards starting the greatest war that the planet had ever seen. And also to claim the One Piece and become the Pirate King, but that wasn't really his prime focus. But the war stuff, it's a fascinating goal. I get that it sounds a bit bland and generic at first, because that's exactly what I thought. But appreciating it requires diving a bit deeper, so consider this. Whether this was intentional or not, Kaido was trying to bring Kozuki Oden's prophecy to fruition. In his journal, Oden stated that 20 years after his death, the world would be engulfed in the biggest war it has ever seen. So this wasn't just war for the sake of war. This is an event that fate has predetermined will happen, and Kaido could very well have been the man to kickstart it. And I also think this hits a lot harder post-Olbaf, because in retrospect, Kaido very much fits one of the descriptions of the sun god Nika, which is obviously the destroyer reading of Nika. And whilst Kaido does not believe himself to be either Nika or Joy Boy, in fact, we're not even sure if he knows about Nika, despite that, Kaido is still doing his best impression of both of them, as when King asked Kaido if he could change the world they live in, Kaido replied, "I'm the only one who can change it." And furthermore, when stating his goal as clearly as possible, Kaido quantifies it as, "We're going to take all of these pampered, noble-born rulers and drag them off their ivory thrones down to the battlefield with us. That's what I call equality and freedom. A world where only war decides a man's true worth." And what really piques my interest most about this is Kaido's use of the word freedom. He believes that plunging the world into war is what will provide the ultimate freedom and equality. To provide equal opportunity for everyone to have and do whatever they want, not because of the families or the wealth that they're born into, but because of what they go out there and take with their strength and willpower. I'm not saying it's a sound philosophy. Obviously, under Kaido's system, you're still born with very natural advantages. But the point is that Kaido wanted to destroy the world as it is and rebirth it in his own ideal image, which is very similar to the Harley prophecy about ending this world and beginning the next one. And Kaido's ideal image is, dare I say, not too dissimilar from what the ancient giants and even some modern day giants believe, that they should exist in a world where physical strength dictates everything. And that philosophical connection is perhaps not surprising, given that Kaido and the rest of the Oni race are almost certainly descendants of the ancient giants. And so Luffy versus Kaido ends up being a clash between 2 individuals embodying opposing principles of the sun god, although neither of them are trying consciously to do this. But what you have is Luffy on one Wano fighting for the liberation of his friends, whilst Kaido is fighting for general destruction. And Wano is a test case for what would happen to the world at large afterwards. Are we going to go down the path of liberation, or are we going to take the rocky road of destruction? So Kaido's goal is definitely something that I appreciate so much more now that we're several years removed from Wano. It definitely packs a lot more punch in retrospect after we learn about the Sun God, the Harley text, and the mural and all of that. But in the moment of Wano, it did feel a little bit generic. It was very much bad man wants to destroy world by starting big war. But to give Kaido more credit for the time, it is deeper than that because he was also looking for the perfect end to his life. This is an aspect of Kaido that I find really interesting, and I wish that it was expanded upon a bit more. But Kaido has this reverence for death, an almost worship of dying in quote the right way. And Kaido is jealous of both Whitebeard and Goldie Roger because he claims that they quote did it right. And that's likely because both of their deaths triggered what he wants to do. It closed off the old era of the world and began a new one, with both Roger and Whitebeard having a much greater effect on the planet in death than they had in life. That is what Kaido wants for himself. And the reason why he's so fixated on death is because Kaido possesses a body that is essentially impossible to kill. He has, for all intents and purposes, immortality, which is very similar to what Prince Loki of Elbaf experienced when he tried to end his own life by jumping down from the Sun Realm to the underworld and being brought to tears by the fact that he could not harm himself, which is a problem that Kaido can sympathize with, as he did the same thing in his introduction by jumping off a sky island. This is a classic case of always coveting the thing it is you can't have. Most people don't want death, and they're quite aware of just how easily it could come because most life is extremely fragile. But Kaido is on the other side of that fence. He is so robust that he couldn't end his own life no matter how hard he tried, and that's a big issue for him because Kaido has a key philosophy that it may not be the way of the times anymore, but death is what completes a person. Kaido cannot die, and he thus views himself as an incomplete person. And this is going to sound really morbid, but Kaido is also actively jealous of those that he kills because they get to achieve that completion. Kozuki Oden would be the primary example of this. Kaido recognized that Oden died in such a spectacularly complete manner that it actively enraged him. And furthermore, the only reason why Momonosuke is even alive is because Kaido didn't deem this pathetic child worthy of being given a complete death by his hand. So Kaido threw Momonosuke into the burning Oden castle to have his life completed in a substandard manner. So Kaido does have this thread going for him during Wano, which is something. It's a pretty nice something. But for me personally, like almost everything else about Kaido, I feel like we don't get to explore it anywhere near as in-depth as I would have wanted. It is there, it is flagged, but there's not a lot of meat to bite into, which is something that very much extends to Kaido's backstory as well. And just before jumping into that, just a quick note on expectations. I've done this already, but I really cannot emphasize just how long readers and watchers were waiting to see Kaido's past. From the moment that Garp first mentioned him in 2006 to the point at which we did receive Kaido's flashback in 2022, and also in a more active sense, Kaido was this antagonist that we had actively been building towards throughout the whole New World era. Caesar, Clown, Doflamingo, Katakuri, and even Big Mom were just stepping stones to reach this man. So 16 years later, it is finally time to get to know Kaido, and when Oda does grace us with this flashback, it plays out like a fast food drinks menu. We see Kaido in small, medium, and then large, and that's just kinda that. Kaido's flashback does shed a bit of light into why he hates the established nobles of the world, because his king as a child tried to sell him to the world government, but everything else feels very much like Kaido is here, then here, then here, and now he's here. It's really missing that usual Oda flashback punch, where you get hit with something emotionally substantive, like Big Mom's flashback, for example. That provided such a fantastic insight into her as a character. We see her childhood on Elbaf in detail, we see her friends, her struggles, her cannibal lubbles, and Oda took his time to flesh out this story over 2 whole chapters. And 2, I get it, that might not sound like a lot, it's not traditionally one of the bigger numbers after all, but Big Mom got 2 whole chapters for her flashback, whilst Kaido got 3.5 pages for his. And Kaido is meant to be an escalation of an antagonist above Big Mom, which is why it feels like nothing happens in his flashback because Oda's got no time at all to tell a story. He's just got to hit the main beats of Kaido's life and call it a day. And just to draw this comparison, Kaido's introduction in chapter 709 195 took 4 pages. So it took longer for the narrator to introduce Kaido than it did to tell his entire backstory. But to be as fair as I can to Oda, I can't help but feel that he was fairly heavily shackled with Kaido's backstory, because his true origins more than likely lie in the Elbaf plot thread of the Ancient Giants, and a massive part of Kaido's history has to do with the Rocks Pirates, which some light has now been shed on, but it's also being kept quite deliberately mysterious, and anything with King is being kept a secret as well, because that pertains to Joy Boy, Nika, and the great mystery that is the One Piece world. So there's only so much that Oda can actually show without blowing the load of some of the biggest overarching plots in the series. But also, in the interest of fairness, Oda himself admitted that he rushed the end of Wano, and he did this because he wanted Shanks to appear outside of the island in time for the release of One Piece Film Red, which at the time was an incredibly hype moment, but as the years continue to pass and Film Red fades from the consciousness of the fanbase, all we're really left with is a rushed ending to Wano, and Kaido is one of the biggest victims of that in my opinion. I mean, obviously I can't be certain, but if it wasn't for that coordinated meta-marketing effort, I wonder if Kaido may have gotten a backstory about the same length as Big Mom. 2 chapters, that's all it would have taken, and I think it would have been great. But what this comes down to is that when people invest, they expect a payoff. And the larger the investment, the larger the amount they expect to pay off. So let's say that you invested a ton of your time into the story stock market. After a year, you would want that investment to have grown and give you a reward for investing that time. But also, it's only been a year, so you don't expect too much. If you've only invested a short amount of time into a character, then you don't have high expectations. However, if you invested your time into Kaido Corp for say 16 years, then you would have extremely high expectations of the return that you're going to get on that investment. Why did I choose 16 years? A very specific number. Well, that's because it is almost the exact length of time from Kaido's first mention by Garp to his defeat at the hand fist of Luffy. Altogether, 617 chapters of One Piece, which at the time of this recording is over half of the series as a whole. For that entire time, the shadow of Kaido was lurking and emerging. And just for fun, what I've done right is I put Kaido's data into an S&P 500 historical calculator, because I think this illustrates the point quite well. Let's say you invested $1,000 dues into the S&P 500 in October 2006 when Kaido was first introduced, and what you would have by May 2022, which is when he was defeated, is that investment would have grown to over $4,000. Obviously, you'd have to adjust for inflation and other things, but the point is that long-term investments are expected to come with pretty great rewards. And the reward that we as readers got for investing 16 years into Kaido was 3.5 pages that you could honestly cut, and it probably wouldn't hugely impact Kaido's overall impression as a character, if indeed it would impact him at all. And I do think that's a pretty big failure for an antagonist of Kaido's position. This wasn't Punk Hazard. We can't just get away with a throwaway antagonist. This was Wano. This was the climax of the Four Emperors saga. Although another factor that very much needs to be considered is that Kaido is a dual antagonist. He does not helm Wano on his own, and he shares his role of concocting Katakuri with Kurozumi Orochi, who acts as the spiritual and emotional threat to the island. Everything that Kaido is missing is present in Orochi. In fact, I do think that Orochi gets in total about 2 chapters for his flashback, but everything that Orochi is missing is present in Kaido. And together, they make a pretty damn good team. But when you examine Kaido on his own, which is what this video series is all about, he does feel a bit superficial, because his role is to be the club. He is the spectacle antagonist, here to provide the raw strength and the cool fightings, which he does do absolutely flawlessly. Kaido is responsible for giving us some of the most memorable action in the entire series. It's always a fearsome and brutal pleasure to watch him fight in whatever form he so chooses, and specifically his fight against Gear 5th Luffy will go down as one of the greatest battles in One Piece, and in my opinion, shonen history in general. So full marks there, but even that opens up another issue. One of my least well-aged comments on this channel was that around 2018-2019, I said that Luffy would not be able to beat Kaido one-on-one. In my mind, this was going to be a group effort from the worst generation because Wano was so stacked with them: Luffy, Zoro, Law Kid, Killer, Hawkins, Drake, and a Scratchman Apu. So I was thinking that this would be less of a one-on-one showcase and more of a one generation topping the previous generation kind of affair. And I was very, very wrong. But in my defense, I wasn't the only one at the time who couldn't see Luffy defeating Kaido one-on-one, because the author Eiichiro Oda himself was also grappling with this idea, and in 2016 he stated, "When Kaido was introduced, I said Luffy can't beat such a strong guy yet, and I've yet to learn how Luffy will defeat him. My audience won't be satisfied if the reason for defeating Kaido is was just because of Luffy's strong punch, so Luffy and I must find a solution. Oda was afraid that he'd made a mistake by making Kaido as strong as he is. At the time that Oda introduced Kaido, he could not see a way for Luffy to beat him. And during Act 1 of Wano, this impression was not helped by an intoxicated Kaido one-shotting Luffy in his then most powerful form. Because from here, Oda had to come up with a reasonable way for Luffy to beat Kaido in the span of 2 weeks of in-world time. And the way that he did that was by accelerating Luffy's development like we've never seen before. To defeat Kaido, Luffy had to unlock 3 separate upgrades in a single arc. He had to master Advanced Armament Haki, then Advanced Conqueror's Haki, and then awaken his Devil Fruit. And the first 2 of those upgrades were nowhere near enough. In total, Luffy lost to Kaido 3 times. 2 of those after the Haki advancements, and it was only after unlocking Gear 5th that Luffy finally overcame Kaido. And how did Luffy finally overcame Kaido? Well, he did it with one big, strong punch, which is the exact thing that Oda said that his audience wouldn't be satisfied by. Although I would actually make the less cynical argument that it wasn't just, one big, strong punch. Because Gear 5th, it was about discovering creativity, versatility, and imagination. It was about using the strength of Luffy's imagination to bridge the gap in power between he and Kaido. But I also can't deny that ultimately Luffy did beat Kaido with one big, strong punch, and as much as I love this fight in general, I'm not the biggest fan of ending it with Bajrang Gun, and I do wish we'd found a more creative end for Kaido than our standard thwack in the face. Although, to refute my own argument there is something quite charming about having the infinite power of imagination and then just going, well, how about I hit him with a really big fist? That usually works. There's a lovely Luffy simplicity at play there, but it is still a kind of underwhelming defeat for me, which puts a neat little bow on everything that is Kaido. He had so much potential to be the greatest antagonist that One Piece has ever known, but he's held back from reaching the top of that podium in almost every area. His motivation is very compelling but underexplored, and only truly appreciated after his time. The emotional heavy lifting of the Wano arc is given to Orochi, so Kaido doesn't have a lot of meat there. Oda also accidentally made Kaido too powerful, he admitted as much, and he struggled to satisfactorily beat him. And even Kaido's defeat itself is kind of undermined because he isn't even the first Emperor of the Sea to be beaten in his own arc. Big Mom losing to Kid and Law a few chapters prior takes that piece of landmark hype away from Kaido. But look, with all of that said, Kaido, he was a great villain, like a really great villain. But I just don't know if really great is enough to meet the bar that Oda set for him. And maybe one day we'll have a more full picture of who this man was once we hit a full-on Rocks Pirates backstory if such a thing ever happens. But for now, Kaido is just missing something, or even a series of somethings that so many other One Piece antagonists have that make them feel complete. Kaido, he felt incomplete to himself because he was unable to die gloriously, and he feels incomplete to me because his story wasn't fully told. And if it was fully told, if this is it, this was the intention all along, then to put it bluntly, it just wasn't as good as so many other antagonists who came before him. And as a result, I think that A tier is more than fair for Kaido, still a top tier bad man, very compelling, but not one that reached his full potential. And you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next.